Verstappen's redemption, Sainz keeps his podium streak alive, and who was at fault for that lap 1 collision between Ricciardo and Albon? Let's dive into the Japanese Grand Prix. So I usually start these with talking about how the race was won, so that would have been talking about how Max Verstappen won this race. But before I get into that, I think I want to discuss that lap 1 collision between Ricciardo and Albon, which ultimately ended both drivers' races before they had even begun. So, we have to rewind this back to the initial launch phase, where both RBs got a terrible start from P10 and P11 on the grid. Both seemed to struggle on that medium tyre compound and got swamped by the soft starters behind them. Both drivers lost 3 places into turn 1 to Bottas, Magnussen and Ocon, and both RBs actually went side by side into turn 1, and I was impressed at this stage as Tsunoda just fired his car back down the inside of Ricciardo in what was a very aggressive move, but very crucial in keeping him out of trouble behind, which is what Ricciardo ultimately fell into. Ricciardo then got boxed in on the inside of turn 1, which allowed Gasly to sweep around his outside, with Lance Stroll trying to follow him around the outside in a similar move to Gasly through turn 2. At this point, Albon was behind Ricciardo through turns 1 and turn 2. So from Ricciardo's perspective, you can see that the only car he's worrying about at this moment is Lance Stroll, as Lance Stroll is on his outside. Through Ricciardo's onboard, you can see him looking through that left-hand side mirror to make sure he's giving enough space to Stroll on the outside and to also fend him off. Whilst this is happening, Alex Albon gets a much better exit out of turn 2 as Ricciardo gets a bit of oversteer on the exit, and Albon sees a gap opening up on the right of Ricciardo and tries to go through with that overspeed he has on Daniel. However, by this stage, turn 3 is approaching and Ricciardo drifts to the right to take the racing line and to also open up the corner and give Lance Stroll space. However, he's completely unaware that Albon is now on his outside and that Albon actually got such a good exit out of the corner and squeezes Albon towards the grass. Albon tries to back out, but by this time it's too late and both drivers go into the barrier. I think this has to be put down to a racing incident in this moment, especially because it was a lap 1 incident. Ricciardo was focused on another driver and wasn't expecting a driver to go on his outside, given that Albon was behind through turns 1 and turn 2. And Albon was also going for a gap here, which was most likely going to disappear, given that Ricciardo was most likely also going to move over to the right-hand side to open up turn 3. If this happens on lap 30 and it's just Albon and Ricciardo racing for position here, I could see a penalty being given to Ricciardo because he's basically forced another driver off the track. But it didn't happen on lap 30, it happened on lap 1. Lance Stroll was also involved. So given it was a first lap, I think it has to go down as a racing incident. Just because there were so many more cars around, it's not an isolated incident, other factors were at play. Alright, now that we have that turn 1 incident out of the way, let's talk about Max Verstappen. Max was put under a bit more pressure than he probably would have liked during qualifying, given that Sergio Perez actually qualified quite well. I believe he was under half a tenth away in P2, which is substantially good for him, given that he usually qualifies 2 to 3 tenths behind Verstappen. Perez had looked very quick all weekend though, so again, it was a bit surprising to see him carry that speed into qualifying, but it was a pleasant surprise, let's say. Max did take pole, and of course Perez came home in P2. Norris was qualified a very strong P3 and that McLaren, while Sainz came home in P4 and Alonso in P5. Both Mercs just didn't replicate the pace they showed in practice and qualified down in P7 and P9, which has been basically what they've been doing all season so far. Looking decent in practice, but then just not being able to replicate that pace in qualifying and of course the race. Whilst the Ferraris got out-qualified by both the McLarens, they did seem to have better race pace from their free practice runs and maybe even enough to challenge Red Bull going into the race, some people thought. The top 9 remained unchanged after the initial race start, so we'll dive into it from that second race start after the red flag, as they had to fix a barrier from the Albon and Ricciardo crash, where again Verstappen managed to hold off Perez going into turn 1. Perez managed to hold on to Verstappen's DRS for a lap or so, but after that Verstappen started to flex his muscle and just drove off into the distance like he has been doing a lot for the past 2 years. He ended up winning by 12.5 seconds, so it wasn't as big as his 20-second margin last year, but it was still a pretty decent size. And of course, it was 20 seconds back to the closest non-Red Bull car. It was a dominant display by Verstappen and a strong bounce back given his DNF in Australia last week. This was a track most suited to Red Bull. It suited them last year, so it was probably going to suit them a lot this year, which it did. So it will be interesting to see if their pace advantage continues on into China. The most interesting part of this race for me has to be the strategy between the Mercedes, the McLarens, Alonso, and the Ferraris. Both McLarens were on a 2-stop, but their higher degradation meant they couldn't go as long as the Ferraris could. Both Mercedes ended up starting on the hards at that second restart, trying to go for a 1-stop, whilst Ferrari split their strategies between Leclerc on a 1-stop and Sainz on a 2-stop. but Carlos was able to run much longer than the McLarens because of their better tyre wear. And finally, Alonso was on the 2-stop, but he actually used the soft tyre in comparison to the usual medium hard that was being run by the rest of the drivers. I think this turned what would have been a genuinely boring race into one which I was actually intrigued to follow the strategy of and to see who came out on top. I'll delve into each driver's race a little bit later on, but it was fascinating, especially in the end couple laps when Russell caught the Alonso and Piastri train. Piastri clearly didn't quite have the pace to overtake Alonso, and given in the final couple of laps he was over a second going into 130R, I think it was clear that Alonso was playing these strategy games, lifting off after 130R to make sure Piastri had DRS to defend from Russell going down the main straight, which is classic Fernando Alonso. This was genius from Alonso, as Russell probably did have the pace to pass him, but it was very reminiscent of what Sainz was doing in Singapore last year. But because he gave Piastri that DRS, he never got the opportunity, never got the opportunity to attack Alonso. Russell, of course, did manage to get past Piastri on the final lap as Piastri locked up into that final chicane and got a bad run onto the main straight. Russell was then able to clear him into turn 1 with the superior straight line speed and the overspeed he got of the Merc. And Piastri's going to be kicking himself for this. He threw away a very solid... It's still a solid finish, but he just threw away that position. It shouldn't happen. It shouldn't happen. He'll be kicking himself for that. It's just a simple mistake. He made it previously in the race as well, locking up into that final chicane, and it was just coming under that pressure from Russell that made him lock up. There was that small incident a couple laps earlier between Russell and Piastri, which we might as well quickly discuss, where Russell realised what Fernando was doing, giving Piastri DRS down the main straight, so he decided he had to try and make a move into the chicane, where of course Piastri wasn't getting DRS. Here Russell switched very, very late to the inside after feinting the outside, and he actually went over the inside curb. Piastri tried to hang it around the outside of Russell, but Russell carried too much speed at the apex and forced Piastri wide, as there just wasn't space for Piastri's car on the outside of that chicane anymore, and that meant Piastri cut across the runoff and kept the position. I think the steward's decision to hand out no penalty for this, so they didn't intervene or anything, was the right decision here. Given no harm was done, no one was damaged, no one had their cars damaged, and Piastri kept the position. If Russell gained the position, I think he would have had to have let Piastri back or given a 10-second time penalty, but given Piastri kept the position, I think it was okay. And this was clearly a case of Russell forcing Piastri off the track rather than Piastri keeping his position by going off the track, because Russell forced him off the track. There was no car space there. Piastri had no other option apart from to cut across that runoff, given Russell forced him off. It wasn't like Russell had left a car space and Piastri, in order to keep the position, decided to go across the runoff. I would also like to give a very solid shout out to the midfield today, who were battling over 10th spot given that Lance Stroll qualified way down the field. There were some great overtakes throughout the S's, and we got to see 5 cars go into the pit lane at once, which is something that rarely happens in Formula 1, and that was really enjoyable to watch. It was also a great strategy race between all of them and was very enjoyable to keep track of, especially given there was no fight directly for the lead. Now, moving on to the top finishes, we of course have Verstappen and Perez in P1 and P2. It was a great race by both Red Bull drivers. They drove extremely well to get that 1-2, and their car was absolutely the best one on track this weekend, especially in race pace. Carlos Sainz came home in P3. He had great tyre management and was able to run longer on his 2-stop strategy than the McLarens or Alonso, which gave him that tyre offset at the end, so he can make those overtakes on Norris and Leclerc stick, and it's a very well-deserved podium for Carlos. He's finished on the podium in every race he's driven in so far this year, as well as out-qualifying Leclerc in the past 2 races, so he's looking extremely good at the moment, and hopefully he can keep this momentum going for the remainder of the season. Leclerc came home in P4 as he executed an extremely good one-stop strategy to get ahead of the Alonso and the McLarens after his poor qualifying. His race was basically perfect apart from his small mistake into Degna 2, which cost him around 4 seconds, and I think he basically maximised his result today. Even without that lock-up, I still think he's finishing in P4. He lacked a small bit of pace compared to Sainz in qualifying, which of course Fred Vasseur attributed to the fact that Leclerc had to use 2 soft tyres during Q1, which meant he only had 1 run in Q3, but it's nothing to worry about. It's a great race from Leclerc. Norris came home in P5 as he lost 2 positions to the Ferraris during the race. The McLaren's worst tyre wear meant they couldn't run as long as Carlos or even Leclerc, and they lost out to both of them because of it, but I still think it was an extremely good race from Norris. He couldn't have done much more, and he maximised the potential of the car, which the same can be said for Fernando Alonso, who I also think maximised 100% of the car's performance to finish P6. He had extremely good race pace, given the pace of his teammate, who was all the way down the field, not even finishing in the points. He played those strategy DRS games at the end, which shows he's still got his race smarts, and of course his pace, raw pace is always still there. So a great job to secure P6, another outstanding drive from Fernando Alonso. George Russell, Lewis Hamilton came home in P7 and P9 for Mercedes. They put on the hard tyres at that second restart, I should be saying, in an attempt to go a hard-to-hard strategy on a one-stop, but their tyre wear was just too bad to make it happen. Both Mercs got jumped by Norris and Sainz after they had made one stop before the Mercs had even pitted once. So at that point, their strategy was completely done for. And this means both drivers adapted to a two-stop strategy, pitting later than both drivers ahead of them on putting on the mediums in an attempt to make up some time. Both drivers were then tasked with hunting down Piastri and Alonso, and whilst Russell was able to make it past Piastri, he couldn't make it past Alonso, and of course Hamilton didn't make up any places. The Mercedes just lacked pace today, and it really showed. Piastri came home P8, he had a decent race but lacked pace overall in comparison to Norris. He made a couple of mistakes into the final chicane, and especially the one on the final lap cost him that spot to Russell, which he will be fuming about. You shouldn't be making a mistake like that. Russell was not going to be able to overtake him onto that final lap. Again, I think his race pace was better comparatively to Norris than it was this time last year. Or sorry, I should be saying 6 months ago at Suzuka. But again, he just wasn't quite as quick, but it was still a decent race. Finally, Yuki Tsunoda came home P10 in the final points paying position, picking up another crucial point for RB. He drove a great race and he managed to hold off Lance Stroll for that P10 position. He was fighting Lance Stroll. Lance Stroll then boxed for those soft tyres at the end, but he couldn't catch back up. So well done to Yuki Tsunoda. Also, a huge shout out to the RB pit crew, which basically got Tsunoda that P10 as he had the quickest pit stop when all those 5 cars came in. So another big shout out to them, and of course to Yuki for scoring P10 and a point in his home Grand Prix. Finally, let's just have a quick chat about the bottom 10 drivers. Lance Stroll came home in P12 and it was an extremely poor performance from him. Obviously he qualified down in P18, which is shocking, especially when his teammate is up in P2. It shouldn't be happening. And whilst he made some good overtakes in the race, especially through the S's, he just still wasn't quick enough. He should have scored points today, but he didn't. He needs an improvement going into China. The Haas's came home in P11 and P13. They both drove a good race, but just didn't quite have the pace to match the RB of Tsunoda ahead. Their speed in a straight line allowed them to keep their positions and allowed them to box early and maintain their positions and hold off the cars behind. But again, they just didn't quite have that overall race pace to challenge for that P10 point. Bottas came home in P14 whilst Zhou DNF'd with an issue. Again, these pit stops are what's killing them in the race. Bottas probably would have been in that fight for that final points paying position if he hadn't have had that slow pit stop when all 5 cars came in. It's killing them and they can't fight with one hand behind their back. The overall speed of their car isn't great, but it's not bad. So they could be up there if they don't have these pit stop issues. But again, they need to fix this out. They said it's not an easy fix and there'll be changes coming in the next couple races. The Alpines came home in P15 and 16 as they tried a one-stop similar to the Mercs, but again, just had 0 pace and couldn't make it work. I really don't have much to say about them. The cars are just slow. They're the only team this year which got slower on race pace comparatively to last year. So they just have to make big upgrades, make those improvements, and hopefully they'll be in a more competitive position when it comes to the second half of the year, possibly after the summer break. Sargent finished last of those still running at the checkered flag and was running 13th, I believe, when he went off but managed to keep it out the barrier. He wasn't in the fight for points today, so he didn't lose anything by going off, but obviously he shouldn't be making these types of errors. Those are still rookie errors and Sargent should be past that by now, and of course Albon DNF'd. You just have to pray that those cars don't have any chassis damage because they still don't have a spare one. Finally, Ricciardo showed decent pace in qualifying in comparison to Tsunoda and in comparison to the first couple races. He showed improvement given he missed FP1 and didn't get any running in FP2. He's got a new chassis coming for China, so hopefully he can keep his momentum going. Of course, I don't think you can't really comment anything on his race given he was out on lap 1. This type of thing happens, so hopefully he can keep the momentum going into China. And that's basically the Japanese Grand Prix. Of course, there wasn't a fight at the front. I still think it was a pretty decent race though, and it was interesting watching all the strategy play out. So I'd probably give it a solid 7 out of 10. And of course, it was great to see all the amazing Japanese fans turn out. They're really, really good to see with all their crazy attire they have, especially those hats. I love those hats. And of course, we're back to China in 2 weeks' time for the first race since 2019. Can you believe it? It's been on the calendar the past 2 years, but has been cancelled due to COVID. And of course, it's also a sprint weekend. I think it's our first one of the year, which will be very interesting. It's going to be a clean slate for basically everyone, so I'm very excited to see what happens. And of course, thank you guys so much for watching and have a great rest of your day.